My name is Mara Ellison, and I was 37 years old the afternoon my father laughed at what my grandfather left me. We were sitting in a probate attorney's office in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, around a polished table that looked too expensive for grief. My father, Leonard, sat straight-backed in his navy blazer, one hand resting near his phone like he was waiting for business, not a will. My stepmother, Celeste, kept smoothing the cuff of her cream sweater. My younger brother, Preston, leaned back with his ankle over his knee, already wearing the expression of a man who expected to walk out with something useful. The attorney read Grandpa Orson's will in a voice that made every sentence sound smaller than it was. Leonard received the remaining cash accounts. Celeste received the handmade dining set Grandpa had built before his hands began to shake. Preston received the old Ford truck he had been asking about since I was in college. Then the attorney looked at me. To my granddaughter, Mara Ellison, I leave the house on Hawthorn Lane, together with $100. For half a second, no one moved. Then my father laughed. Not a surprised laugh. Not even a sad one. It was the kind of laugh people use when they want everyone else to know they are not the one being embarrassed. He left you a condemned house and grocery money, Leonard said, loud enough for the receptionist outside to hear. That sounds about right. Preston covered his mouth, but his shoulders moved. Celeste looked down at her lap, pretending kindness while she let the silence do its work. The attorney slid a thin envelope across the table. Inside was the deed, a worn $100 bill, and a small folded note in Grandpa's blocky handwriting. East wall, dining room, count from the window. I did not cry. I did not ask what it meant. I just folded the note, placed the bill in my coat pocket, and walked out with the thing they all thought was worthless. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 78% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. I had spent most of my life being underestimated in quiet ways, which is different from being hated. Hatred at least has heat. What my family gave me was colder than that. They treated me like something useful but forgettable, the kind of person you called when a form was missing, then ignored once the problem was solved. At the county records office, I worked 3 floors below the courthouse, in a room that smelled like toner, old paper, and coffee that had been reheated too many times. My job was to preserve the things people only cared about when something went wrong. Deeds, mortgage releases, tax liens, probate notices, power of attorney forms, the paper trail of every promise people made when money was involved. I liked it there. There was honesty in a document if you knew how to read past the clean margins. A missing notary stamp could say more than a handshake. A rushed signature could say more than a speech. Dates and filing numbers did not flatter anyone. They just waited for someone patient enough to line them up. My father never respected that kind of patience. Leonard liked work that looked impressive from the outside. Real estate signs with his name in blue letters. Lunch meetings at places with cloth napkins. Phone calls where he used words like equity, leverage, and opportunity. When people asked about me, he smiled in that careful public way and said, "Mara works with paperwork. Just paperwork." He said it the way another father might say his daughter was still figuring herself out. As if I spent my days alphabetizing dust instead of helping widows locate the deed their husbands had hidden in a kitchen drawer, or showing nervous families where the truth had been recorded before they made a mistake they could not undo. Preston got a different voice from him. Preston was an entrepreneur. Preston had vision. Preston took risks. It did not matter that half his projects ended with unpaid contractors and calls he stopped answering. In my father's version of the family, Preston was always one deal away from proving everyone wrong, while I was one quiet paycheck away from disappearing completely. Celeste helped maintain that version with softer hands. She never insulted me directly. She just tilted her head and said things like, "Mara has always been so practical," or, "Not everyone is meant to chase big things." Then she would touch Preston's shoulder like he was the big thing in the room. For years, I let them have that story. It was easier than arguing, and maybe part of me believed quiet work did make me smaller. But as I sat in my car outside that attorney's office, with Grandpa's folded note in my pocket and my father's laughter still ringing behind my ribs, I realized something I should have known sooner. Paperwork was only boring to people who needed no one to read it. Every Sunday during those last 3 years, I drove to Hawthorn Lane with a grocery bag in the passenger seat and a county records tote in the back. Grandpa Orson never asked me to come. That was part of why I kept going. He had the old kind of pride, the kind that would rather sit in a cold room than call someone and admit the furnace was acting up again. So I learned his ways. I checked the thermostat, sorted the mail by the side door, filled the orange pill organizer, and made sure the appointment cards matched the calendar on the refrigerator. On Tuesdays, I took a long lunch and drove him to physical therapy, where he smiled at the receptionist and pretended the exercises did not hurt. My father called those visits, "your little routine," as if caring for someone became childish when it did not produce a profit. Preston came by twice that I remember. Once to borrow Grandpa's extension ladder, and once to ask whether the old Ford still had the original title. Celeste rarely made it farther than the front hallway. She would press a tissue to her nose and say the house had that damp old person smell, then wait outside until Leonard finished pretending to be concerned. No one stayed long enough to learn which floorboard dipped near the pantry or how Grandpa liked his coffee thin because strong coffee made his hands shake. I did not think of any of that as proof of love at the time. It was just what needed doing. Some weeks he was sharp enough to correct the evening news. Other weeks he stared too long at a bill before handing it to me, with a quiet, embarrassed look that made me turn my face toward the window. But even when his body weakened, his habits did not. He still noticed when a document had been refolded wrong. He still ran one finger along the edge of an envelope before opening it. He still believed paper had a memory if people were careless enough to leave one behind. The last fall before he died, I found him sitting alone in the dining room, his palm resting against the east wall. The afternoon light was thin, and dust moved through it like slow weather. I asked if something was wrong. He did not answer right away. He just looked at the wall, then at me, with eyes clearer than they had been all month. "People only see rot," he said, "when they're already hoping something is worthless." I thought he meant the house. I told him the place still had good bones. Grandpa gave me a tired little smile. "Good bones aren't the part they're afraid of, Mara." I carried that sentence through winter, through the hospital calls, through the funeral, and into that attorney's office, where my father laughed. Only now, with Grandpa's note in my pocket, did I understand. He had not been grieving the house. He had been pointing to it. The morning after the will reading, I drove to Hawthorn Lane before work. Grandpa's note was folded in my coat pocket, and the $100 bill sat behind my driver's license. I told myself, I only wanted to see the house with my own eyes before Leonard's voice could keep turning it into a ruin in my head. From the road, I understood why strangers might believe him. The white paint had peeled along the porch rails, one gutter hung loose over the side steps, the front walk was cracked down the middle, with grass growing through like the house was slowly being taken back by the ground. A blue tarp covered one corner of the roof, tied down with rope. Grandpa must have knotted himself. It looked tired. It looked poor. It looked exactly like the kind of place my father could point at and call worthless without anyone arguing. Then I used the spare key Grandpa had kept on my ring for years and unlocked the door. The inside smelled faintly of lemon oil, dust, and the cedar blocks he kept in the closets. Morning light crossed the floorboards in clean rectangles. The entry table held a tray for keys, a small bowl for loose screws, and a stack of mail weighted down by a river stone. Nothing was careless. Nothing was abandoned. In the kitchen, every drawer had a label written in Grandpa's blocky hand. Towels, batteries, appliance manuals. The tax folders sat in labeled boxes by year, and even the coats in the hall closet were arranged from lightest to heaviest, as if he still expected winter to arrive on schedule. I stood there with my hand on the back of a chair and felt the contradiction settle in my chest. The outside of the house told one story, the inside told another. The dining room was at the back, facing the overgrown yard. Grandpa had eaten most of his meals there after walking to the kitchen became harder. The east wall was paneled in narrow strips of pine, warmer in color than the other walls, newer too. I noticed the small nail heads set too evenly. I noticed one strip near the baseboard sitting a fraction proud of the rest. A knock sounded behind me. Esther Whitlock stood on the porch with a paper bag of muffins in one hand, and her gray hair pinned crookedly, like she had left in a hurry. "I saw your car," she said. "Figured you'd come before the others did." I let her in, and when her eyes reached the dining room, her mouth tightened. "Your grandfather worked on that wall 3 times last year," she said. I looked at the pine paneling. Was something wrong with it? Esther shook her head. "Not with the wall." Then she looked at me carefully. "He didn't trust many people near that room, but he always said you knew how to read what other folks walked past." I did not touch the wall that morning. That may sound strange, considering the note in my pocket and Esther standing there with fear tucked behind her eyes, but Grandpa had taught me better than to tear into something just because I wanted answers. Old houses remember every careless hand. So I took photographs first. The full wall, the baseboards, the nail heads, the narrow strip that sat slightly raised. Then I called Owen Pike. Owen was 55, broad through the shoulders, with a beard gone silver at the chin, and hands that looked permanently stained by varnish. He had learned restoration work from Grandpa back when old houses were still repaired, instead of gutted for open-concept kitchens. When I told him which wall, he went quiet for a moment. "Orson's dining room?" he asked. "Yes." He came that evening with a canvas tool roll, and no questions he did not need answered. Esther stayed in the kitchen, pretending to arrange muffins on a plate while watching every move he made. Owen ran his palm over the pine paneling, tapped twice near the baseboard, then looked at me. "This piece was meant to come out," he said. He did not pry it loose, he eased it free. There was a difference. The strip lifted with a soft wooden sigh, and behind it was a narrow hollow wrapped in plastic sheeting. My mouth went dry before I saw anything inside. Owen stepped back without being asked. "This is yours," he said. I reached in and pulled out a small metal box, cool and dusty in my hands. There was no stack of cash, no jewelry, no dramatic treasure wrapped in velvet. Inside were several thin folders sealed in plastic, a second $100 bill pressed flat between 2 pieces of cardboard, and a small index card written in Grandpa's hand. "If they laughed, you're in the right place." For a second, the room blurred. Not because I was crying, because I could hear my father laughing in that attorney's office, and I could feel Grandpa somehow answering him from inside the wall. The second bill was older than the first, soft at the edges, with a serial number circled in red ink. The same red ink marked the tabs on the folders. I spread them carefully across the dining table. Mortgage, deed, POA, lease, transfer. Each label had 2 digits beside it, and each pair matched a section of the serial number. That was when I understood. The $100 was never grocery money. It was not even the secret, it was the index. Grandpa had built a filing system inside the one place my father was too proud to inspect, and every number on that bill pointed to a folder. I opened the first one with both hands steady on the paper. The top page was a home equity document. At the bottom was my grandfather's name, written in a hand that looked almost like his. Beneath it, as witness, was my father's signature. I stared at my grandfather's name until the letters stopped looking like letters and became evidence. Orson Ellison. The signature had the right shape at first glance. The long O, the careful double L, the final N dipping slightly below the line, but it was too smooth. Grandpa's real signature had pressure in it, tiny pauses where his hand slowed, a faint tremor in the last years that made the ink thicken at the turns. This one looked copied, not written. I pulled the first page closer. It was a home equity line of credit opened against the Hawthorn Lane property for $286,400. The approval date was 16 months before Grandpa died. The bank stamp was clean. The notary seal was raised. The document looked official in the way dangerous things often do, dressed neatly enough that most people stop asking questions. But I knew the date. Grandpa had fallen in the hallway the week before and fractured 2 bones in his right hand. I remembered driving him home from urgent care with his arm wrapped and elevated. I remembered cutting his toast because he could not hold a knife. And according to this document, that same hand had signed a bank form 3 days later with perfect control. I went still. Owen was quiet behind me. Esther had stopped pretending to fuss with the muffins. The old house seemed to hold its breath. I turned to the next page. An appraisal was attached, dated 2 weeks before the loan closed. The property had been valued at $74,000, with notes describing severe structural deterioration, likely mold, roof failure, and limited resale potential. I read those phrases twice. They sounded less like an appraisal and more like a prepared excuse. Then I looked around the dining room. The clean labels, the sealed folders, the wall that had opened without splintering because Grandpa had designed it to open. This was not the home of a man, too confused to understand his property. This was the home of a man building a case while everyone else thought he was fading. The third page listed Leonard Ellison as witness. Not borrower, not owner. Witness. A careful distance, close enough to help the paper pass, far enough to pretend innocence later. My father had signed as witness on a document my grandfather could not have signed himself. Then I opened the appraisal folder. Inside was a photograph of roof damage, but the angle was wrong. Another photo showed foundation cracks, but I recognized the wall. It was the vacant house 2 lots over, the one the county had condemned years ago. That was when the first piece of the truth settled into place. My father had not only laughed at the junk house, he had helped create the lie that made it look like junk. I did not call my father that night. That was the first sensible thing I did after finding his name on the paper. The old version of me would have wanted to hear him explain it. Not because I believed him, but because daughters raised on half-love learn to give fathers one more chance, even when the evidence is lying open on a table. Instead, I photographed every page, returned each folder to its plastic sleeve, and wrote down the order in which I had found them. Mortgage, appraisal, witness line, wrong house in the photographs. I kept my hand moving until the shaking left it. Leonard called the next morning before 8. "Have you been over there yet?" he asked. "No, good morning. No, how are you holding up?" "Just the house." "I stopped by," I said. He exhaled, like I had confirmed something he was waiting to use. "Then you saw what I meant. It's a liability, Mara. Taxes, insurance, roof work, mold remediation. You start opening walls in a place like that and you'll find 10 more problems." The word opening made me look across my kitchen table at the folders stacked inside my tote bag. "I haven't made any decisions," I said. "You don't need to make it complicated." His voice warmed, which meant he was about to sell me something. "Preston has a buyer who can take it off your hands. Cash, no inspections, fast close." By lunch, Preston was standing outside the records office beside his black SUV, holding a folder like he had dressed up generosity and brought it to visit. He gave me that boyish smile people kept rewarding long after it stopped being charming. 90,000, he said. Cash offer. Close in 10 days. You walk away clean. I looked at the number on the first page. It was higher than the fake appraisal. Low enough to be an insult. High enough to sound like help. "That was quick," I said. He shrugged. "I know people. No inspections? Buyer doesn't care. Tear down, most likely." Then he gave a small laugh. "Take it, Mara. You're not built for property. You're built for paperwork." A year earlier, that sentence might have bruised me. That day, it unlocked something. Because paperwork was exactly what he was afraid of. I told him I would review it. I did not say with whom. I did not say when. I took the folder back inside, scanned every page after hours, and found the line he must have hoped I would miss. The offer was tied to a holding company formed 6 weeks earlier. Its mailing address matched Preston's office suite. That night, I searched the public filings until a second document surfaced. A letter of intent between that holding company and a regional developer, dated 3 weeks before Grandpa died. It referenced the rear acreage, future access rights, and something no one in my family had ever mentioned to me: mineral and energy lease options. The estimated value on the attached sheet was not $90,000. It was just over $1.9 million. I did not sleep much after seeing that number. $1.9 million has a way of changing the temperature of a room, even when it is only printed on paper. I sat at my kitchen table until after midnight with the developer's letter beside Grandpa's folders, trying not to let the size of it distract me from the shape of it. Money made people emotional. Documents made them precise. I needed precise. The next morning, I called Tessa Monroe from a referral note tucked inside one of Grandpa's folders. Her office was above an antique coin shop in Letitz, up a narrow staircase that smelled like old carpet and metal polish. Tessa was 41, sharp-eyed, with silver hoops and a black sweater, dusted faintly with paper fibers. She did not ask me why I had come. She only put on cotton gloves and held out her hand. I gave her both $100 bills. She studied the first under a magnifier, then the second, the one from the wall with the serial number circled in red. She checked the paper, the ink, the series year, the seal, the small red marks near the margin. For 20 minutes, she said almost nothing. I liked her immediately. Finally, she set the bill down on a clean sheet of glass. "It's not rare enough to make you rich, if that's what someone told you." "No one told me anything," I said. "My grandfather hid it." That made her look up. I showed her the folder tabs and the matching number pairs. Her expression changed in the smallest possible way, not surprise exactly, but recognition. "This isn't a collectible," she said. "It's a control marker." She explained that the bill itself was ordinary, but the way Grandpa had marked it tied it to the folders. The serial number, the red ink, the tab codes, the matching sequence together. They showed the documents had been organized before his death, not invented afterward by a granddaughter with something to gain. "He wasn't leaving you money," Tessa said. "He was leaving you away, to prove timing." I carried that sentence straight to Grant Holloway. Grant's office was nothing like my father's real estate world. No glass conference table. No performance. Just case files. 2 framed maps of Lancaster County. And a mug that said "Trust but Verify." He read longer than I expected. He moved from the home equity document to the appraisal, from the false photographs to the developer letter, from the bill to Tessa's notes. When he finally leaned back, he did not smile. "Your grandfather didn't leave you a house," he said. "He left you standing inside the evidence." I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my hands flat on my knees. "What do I do?" "First, you stop talking to your family about the property," he said. "No accusations, no explanations, no emotional emails. We copy everything, preserve the originals, and build a timeline." Then he tapped the folder, with the red-coded tabs. "Because whoever did this is going to want you rushed, angry, or careless. We are not going to give them any of those things." Grant moved faster than he sounded. 2 days after our first meeting, he called and told me to meet him at the county building after lunch. Not at my office, but 1 floor above it, where the older probate filings were kept behind a locked glass door most people walked past without noticing. I had passed that door hundreds of times, with coffee in one hand and file requests in the other. I had never once imagined my grandfather's name was waiting behind it. A records supervisor I knew, Mrs. Vance, met us with a clipboard and the careful expression of someone who understood that routine paperwork sometimes stopped being routine. Grant handed over his authorization, my identification, and a certified copy of the probate notice. Mrs. Vance checked every page twice before she disappeared into the back room. For 5 minutes, neither of us spoke. I listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft grind of a copier somewhere down the hall. When she returned, she carried a sealed affidavit packet in a gray envelope. "Filed by Orson Ellison," she said. 4 years ago. Release condition triggered by probate notice and beneficiary verification." My hands went cold. Grant opened it first, not because he did not trust me, but because he knew I needed someone steady between me and whatever came next. The affidavit was written in Grandpa's plain, stubborn language. He stated that he had not authorized Leonard Ellison to open any credit line against Hawthorn Lane. He had not agreed to sell the rear acreage. He had not signed any power of attorney giving Leonard or Preston control over the property. He believed attempts had been made to pressure him while his health was declining, and he was preserving this statement in case the person he trusted found the supporting records. The person he trusted. I read that line 3 times. Then Grant turned to the attached trust documents. That was where the story changed size. The land behind Hawthorn Lane was not just overgrown pasture and old maple trees. Years earlier, a regional energy company had approached Grandpa about mineral and subsurface lease options tied to the back acreage. Instead of selling, he had placed the rights into a protective land trust. The estimated option value was just over $1.9 million. But the money was not the part that made my throat close. The trust named me as successor trustee. Not Leonard, not Preston, May. There was a condition. Within 30 days of probate notice, I had to present the original control marker and supporting documents Orson had hidden, proving I had followed the instructions myself. If I failed, control would pass to a Pennsylvania preservation nonprofit, and no private developer could touch the land for 25 years. Grandpa had built 2 protections at once, one for me and one against them. I stood there in the records room, looking at numbers big enough to ruin people, and all I could think was how heavy trust felt when it finally landed in your hands. The $100 bill had not made me rich. It had asked me whether I was willing to become responsible. The pressure started the way pressure usually starts in families like mine, not with threats, but with concern. Leonard called first, his voice low and patient, like he was speaking to someone standing too close to the edge of a roof. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said. I looked at the trust documents spread across Grant's conference table and kept my voice even. "About my own inheritance? About things you don't understand," he said. "That's what worries me." There it was again. The old shape of him, not angry yet, not desperate enough to beg. Just certain that if he sounded like a father, I might forget he had signed his name beneath a lie. He told me I was grieving, that grief made people suspicious, that Grandpa had been confused near the end and could turn a small misunderstanding into a war from beyond the grave. I let him talk until he ran out of soft words. Then Celeste called. She did not mention documents. She never started with the thing she wanted. She started with Preston's children, with his mortgage, with how hard the last year had been on him. Her voice trembled in careful places. She said Leonard had made mistakes, but every family had mistakes, and not every mistake deserved to become public. I stood in my kitchen watching rain gather on the window glass, listening to her build a bridge out of guilt and ask me to walk across it. "Mara," she whispered, "do you really want to be the reason your brother loses everything?" For a moment, I felt the old reflex rise in me. Explain, comfort, make myself smaller, so someone else could breathe easier. Then I looked at the folder on my table, the one marked POA in Grandpa's red code, and thought about his hand wrapped after the fall. "I'm not the reason," I said. "I'm just the person who found the paper." She went quiet after that. Preston chose text messages. Short, sharp ones that arrived between work emails and grocery reminders. He said I was being dramatic. He said I did not know how real estate worked. He said Grandpa would be ashamed of me for tearing the family apart over a house I never wanted. An hour later, he sent a photograph of his youngest daughter at a school recital, as if a child's smile could erase a forged signature. I did not answer. Grant had told me silence would feel unnatural. He was right. Silence felt like leaving a door unlocked while people shouted outside it. But every message they sent told me the same thing. They did not ask what I had found. They did not ask whether it was true. They only asked me not to use it. That was when I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach me. A family that needs your silence is not asking for love. It is asking for cover. 3 days after Preston's last message, Leonard stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and invited me to what he called a family settlement meeting. He said it would be better for everyone to sit down like adults. He said there would be an attorney present. He said the house had become a distraction from what really mattered, which was keeping the family intact. By then, I knew that when my father said family, he usually meant obedience with better lighting. The meeting was held in the same probate office where they had laughed at me. Same polished table, same gray carpet, same framed print of a covered bridge on the wall. Leonard sat near the head this time instead of directly at it, trying to look generous. Celeste was beside him, with a tissue folded neatly in her hand, dry and ready. Preston kept checking his phone, but his knee bounced under the table. That was new. Their attorney pushed a document toward me before anyone asked how I was. A sale agreement. $112,000 for Hawthorn Lane, payable through Preston's holding company. The language called it a fair market resolution of a distressed inherited property. I almost admired the phrasing. It made theft sound like housekeeping. Leonard leaned forward. This is generous, Mara. More than generous, for a house nobody wants. I looked at the page, then at him. Nobody? His mouth tightened. Grant Holloway sat to my right, calm as stone. Tessa Monroe sat to my left with a slim folder in front of her, and the kind of expression that made people regret underestimating quiet women. I reached into my bag and placed the original $100 bill on the table, not the one from the wall, the first one, the one from the will reading. Leonard gave a short laugh. Still carrying grocery money? I did not answer him. I opened Grant's packet and laid out the documents in order. The appraisal with photographs from the wrong house, the home equity papers, the questionable power of attorney, the developer letter, the trust excerpt, and Grandpa's affidavit. One by one, the heir left the room. Tessa explained the bill's markings in a voice so plain it became impossible to argue with. Grant explained the trust condition. I explained only what I had seen with my own eyes. The wall, the folders, the dates, the hand my grandfather could not have used. Preston's face changed first. Celeste's tissue finally reached her mouth. Leonard stared at the papers like they had betrayed him personally. You were right about one thing, Dad, I said. Grandpa did leave me $100. He just hid the rest of the truth behind it. Leonard tried to laugh again, but there was no room left for it. The sound came out thin and unfinished. He reached for the appraisal, like touching it might turn it back into something harmless, but Grant placed one hand over the folder before he could move it. These are copies, Grant said. The originals are secured. That was the moment my father understood I had not come to ask permission. Preston pushed back from the table, his face pale beneath his tan, and started saying he had only followed advice, that the developer had approached him, that none of this was as simple as it looked. Celeste began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the practiced softness of a woman who had survived for years by making other people feel cruel for noticing the truth. I watched all three of them and felt something inside me settle. Not victory. Victory is too clean a word for watching your family run out of lies. What I felt was distance. The kind you feel when a storm finally moves far enough away that you can hear your own breathing again. Grant informed them that the documents had been forwarded to Deputy Marla Keene with the county's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. He said the estate would cooperate with any civil review, and that no sale of Hawthorn Lane would be discussed while the trust and forged documents were under examination. Leonard's attorney stopped taking notes. He just sat very still. My father looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. Mara, he said, don't do this. I thought about Grandpa's hand on the east wall. I thought about the folded note, the second bill, the red marks, the photographs of a house that was not his. I thought about every Sunday I had mistaken responsibility for being ordinary. I'm not doing this, I said. Grandpa did. I'm just refusing to bury it. Nobody answered. I did not sign the sale agreement. I left the $100 bill on the table long enough for Leonard to stare at it, then folded it back into my wallet and walked out of the same office where they had once laughed at me. The investigation took months. Leonard faced civil action from the estate and a criminal referral over the forged documents. Preston lost the developer contract before winter. Celeste sold her boutique quietly the following spring. I did not celebrate. I kept Hawthorn Lane. I repaired the roof first, then the porch, then the dining room wall, leaving one narrow panel removable. A year later, I started free Sunday workshops there for seniors and families who needed help understanding deeds, mortgages, liens, and powers of attorney before they signed away something they loved. The original $100 bill now hangs in a frame on the east wall. Under it, I placed Grandpa's words, "Look where greedy people are too proud to look." What I learned from all of this is that family is not proven by who shares your name. Family is proven by who pays attention when no one is watching. My grandfather did not love me with grand speeches or expensive gifts. He loved me by trusting me with the truth. He saw the part of me everyone else dismissed, the quiet part, the careful part, the part that read the small print and noticed what others walked past, and he made that the key. For years, I thought being underestimated meant I was small. I thought silence meant weakness. I thought patience meant letting louder people take up all the space. But sometimes, the quietest person in the room is not lost. Sometimes, she is listening. Sometimes she is remembering. Sometimes she is becoming strong in a way no one notices, until it is too late to control her. That house taught me something I will never forget. People who want to use you will call your inheritance a burden. They will call your boundaries selfish. They will call your questions disrespectful. They will dress greed up as concern and pressure as love. But real love does not need your silence to survive. Real love does not ask you to bury the truth so someone else can keep looking innocent. Recovery does not always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like fixing a roof, rebuilding a porch, teaching someone else how to read the document before they sign it. Sometimes healing is not about making your family admit they were wrong. It is about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs their permission to stand in what is true. My grandfather left me $100 bill, but the money was never the gift. The gift was the lesson. Look closer, keep records, trust what you know, and never let people who laughed at your hands decide what those hands are capable of holding. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by your own family, only to realize later that your quiet strength was the thing they should have respected most? If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.